It is my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Cahan. Bruce and I have worked together in the past, and you'll notice his white, pristine financial analyst shirt that he's wearing. He's from Wall Street originally and has maintained the integrity. So why don't we come up and we'll get, oh yes, I forgot to mention he has the signature Mont Blanc pen as well. So here we go. Bruce?
Thank you, Mike. Well, thank you. Great. It's really a pleasure to be here and to present for the first time in this forum some research that goes back actually 21 years. As Mike says, I am a recovering Wall Street lawyer, Hong Kong merchant banker, geospatial technology pioneer for the federal government, 9/11 responder, and Ashoka Fellow, and I teach ethics and finance here at Stanford. And just like Mike made a dedication in his remarks, yesterday was the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And so my challenge in processing that mentally was how might I protect my sons, my twin sons were 8, how would I protect them? How would I provide Homeland Security in New York? And the answer I came to is I couldn't do it unless there was Homeland Security everywhere. So I'll give you a quick outline of what we're about to cover. We'll cover it very quickly because of the time limits. We're at an innovation conference, and I thought it would make sense for you to see that there are disruptors that need to be in these rooms, that we are not using to fuel innovation. And actually, there are thousands of hidden figure disruptors. And it's not just today. It's going back at least 130 years, 150 years of my research. Do you know who Hedy Lamarr is? She invented Wi-Fi to beat the Nazis. Do you know who Elijah McCoy is? He invented a lubrication system to make steam trains easier to manage. And his system was called the Real McCoy system. Marie was a nurse who worked late nights. She invented home security systems. Patricia, from a community in Harlem, saw her community going blind because they couldn't afford laser eye surgery, cataract surgery. She invented it. Badass. Fred, from the Navajo Nation, helped with nuclear and physics. Jesse helped invent the cell phone. Guillermo, from Guadalajara, scrounging for radio parts, invented color TV. Gladys, I worked in geospatial technologies for 20 years, never heard about Gladys. She invented GPS. Tom, you probably know Tom. Obviously, we have our own Tom Byers here. Tom was deaf from scarlet fever at age 8 or so. He invented ways to capture what he couldn't sense in real time. So I asked at this Disruptive Technology Conference what we will do as a community of investors to find and cultivate, mentor these disruptors who come from a group that I've acronymed as Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Disabled, and Underrepresented. For short, biters, and there's total coincidence in rhyming with the president's name, I honestly. So now let's get into the meat of the talk. We are navigating complexity, as the other speakers have talked. Many of you deal with the financial system. This is a very simplified circuit board view of it from the Federal Reserve, asking themselves, what did we miss in the 2008 crisis? And what they missed is, as my good friend Ram would tell me, Bruce, you're talking about a circuit board that does only 4 things. It transforms risk, return, asset type, and maturity, and it does it through many different hands and handlers. And what many of you think you know about finance is in that center kind of area, but the top layer is the only thing that's really controlled by the financial regulators. And we need to move risk from the official system or the regulated system into a slightly unregulated system, but we need to do it better. And so my clinical view of finance, which comes from 4 hours sitting with our esteemed professor in Aeroastro, who's from Hungary and has landed stuff on the moon, and George says, Bruce, I can't understand my 401k. So 4 hours to get to this slide. And I said, George, what it is, investors put their money into different structures. Those funds go into investments, which are claims on real assets. They're not real assets. The real assets are the people, the business, the cities. To the extent we don't really understand what finance people do like me or you, we put in uninvested reserves or cash equivalents, and then ultimately there are impacts. But to the extent that you and others like you have been dealing at that investment layer, you think that's real. You think because you hold a stock, that's the real asset. It is not, okay? And so you live on spread, and if we could understand those impacts better, we would have business intelligence to reduce your risk. And then we would have trust in the financial system. It's kind of elemental, but it's important. Okay, so how do we measure investment value? You hear lots of people claim different impacts as having value. And for me, my aha came in researching the periodic table of elements. And what's beautiful about this early version of the periodic table is it did 2 things. It harmonized what people were calling what they could measure under certain labels. And then, with great humility, something, of course, that's rare on campuses like Stanford, you had blank spaces for stuff we knew must exist, or they knew must exist. They didn't know how to measure it or what to call it. And eventually, we added more elements, and we refined the atomic weights and for what we thought we knew. It's an incredible dual insight into how a community of learners and scientists could work together. So let's build a periodic table of quality of life, right? We might start with health. And we would very quickly learn that urban systems, water, sanitation, matter a lot because you could treat people at Stanford Hospital, or you could clean up the water in the air, and you get a far faster reduction in risk. And then you could ask, well, what's the source of the energy, as Ram told us? Is it fossil or is it clean? And then you could ask, well, what's the effect on climate change that we're dealing with as risk to quality of life? And in a few mouse clicks, I've shown you the basics to build a periodic table of quality of life. You saw how those adjacencies interact across the table. You saw what in finance we would call a value at risk calculation. I put an F in front of it for functional value at risk. And the functional value at risk, when you're balancing a portfolio, you're saying, look, I could buy or sell Google stock, I could add a bond or whatever, and ultimately I'm looking at the portfolio yield through expansionary and recessionary times. I call this a credit rating of sustainable resiliency, which asks for the next 10 years, what is the likelihood that every quality of life element, health, urban systems, et cetera, will improve by 10% or stayed in their way? How will the risk factors to 100,000 per capita people in, pick any geography, improve? And what's that likelihood over the next 10 years versus the last 10 years? Oops, sorry. Not my clicker. And this turns into bank risk credit ratings, which the regulators call CAMELS ratings. We hear about it as stress tests, where half of the rating by my research comes from non-performing loans. Well, they don't perform because those impacts that I showed you earlier are not so positive as to keep paying the debt to produce them. Sorry. When I've tried to, and I'll go through, this is a much more detailed view, we don't have time for it, of how you would build each element based on the last 10 years of budget that has been appropriated to that element versus the gaps in this case, public safety, that produce the budget that the government would have spent. And the importance of working with government budgets is this gives us a price-performance ratio that is in real money. The SDGs, as I'm about to show you, aren't real money. So, in the interest of time, clicking through, and as Mike said, and as the other speakers have said, we will have lots of data. Hopefully it'll be secure, and we can use that to more specifically target how those elements are improving and to reward those communities that are paying attention to it. This creates what I've called storytelling money, where the money that you are putting to work, let's say as an impact investor, let's say as Stanford's endowment, which is not an impact investor but has long multi-generation purposes, can say, these are my priorities. I'm the limited partner. I want you to do X, Y, Z. The portfolio company can report those results. The sustainable fund manager can put those two stories together. And you can have the transparency to see how does that line up with the places that are impacted by the company or the project that is invested in. Then I turn to slumps, which are called informal settlements. Being at Stanford, you end up in rooms that you're really not supposed to end up with, and that happened to me. And so this research was supported by the Wellcome Trust in the UK to my nonprofit Urban Logic. And they said, Bruce, this is all well and good. We are going to invest in improving the water and sanitary health, called WASH, for 12 slums in Fiji and 12 in Indonesia. How can we have this great photo op. We launch the project, everybody comes, the prime minister, whatever, and then we come back 5 years later and nothing is working. How do we fix that? And I said, well, have you tried paying the people who live in the slum to maintain the quality of performance of this new infrastructure? And they have not. So I went to try to solve that problem using the periodic table. And there are many, many papers, peer-reviewed up the wazoo, about these problems. And they don't tell you a thing about paying the people who live in a slum to keep everything running smoothly. They tell you how to keep the money in the hands of people who don't live in the slum to continue to talk about improving life in the slum. I don't think that's a good approach to dignity, and I don't think it's a good approach to anything effective. So what would a general economic model of informal settlements look like? And I couldn't find one, so I decided to make one. And so, because if I didn't have an economic model, I didn't know how much to pay for what services would be performed by the people who live in the slums. But this works at all scales, local, regional, national. And here's a forthcoming paper that's going through its peer review that describes all this. That's 5 years of work. And here's the basics for what I call the GEM, General Economic Model for Slums. You've had an explanation of the periodic table of quality of life elements. The next component is a 3-layered map of the world as needs, capacities to meet those needs, and money. The needs come off of the periodic table, and the periodic table comes off the government's, whatever the local government's definition of needs would be, right? Because that's been instantiated in their process forever. The capacities might be, think about a Wikipedia of how do I solve clean water in slum problems depending on the latitude, longitude, the rains, the seasons, et cetera, and making sure that the people who live in the place you're trying to improve have a say in which capacity is used because, because too often the people who put the money in the money layer are telling you which capacity you're going to use. And it doesn't work. And it's disrespectful. And doesn't teach people how to make decisions for themselves. The other elements I don't have time to go through because Michael pulled the cane out on me. And, but suffice it to say, this can work at the most local level. This is a paper that came out last year that takes what's called the village finance system in Indonesia, which for the first time was an accounting system at the very, lowest level, if you will, of the governmental pyramid, and says we can match what you spend, which for the first time this includes all money that goes into the village hands, not just the government money. We can track that to even SDGs. And as you saw in my model, there's an SDG translation engine, okay? Because the SDGs are an artificial thing. So this research is important. I only have a few more slides. We know the urbanization trends are massive, so more people are going to be in cities, which are going to have more slums. So we're going to have to remediate the slums faster. And we know development dollars have been largely unaccounted for over the last 50 years. But a lot of money has gone into development projects. The SDGs, which I know some here may think that they are the Valhalla, but I think they're just kind of pretty colors, right? Because if they're not in government budgets, then, I mean, have fun with them, but they're not making a consistent systemic impact in the places that money is supposed to go. Here is Indonesia. In the gray is where they don't have data for SDGs. The majority, they don't have. And here's how they use the SDGs to say the gold is what they're going to ask donor nations to provide. So it's a fundraising approach, being kind. The government budgets don't do SDGs. As you see here for Fiji, even though their constitution says they have to do certain SDG equivalent activities, the red shows that they'll do it if they have the money, which means they won't do it. And then you have some corruption issues, where if you could get the money via digital wallets to the hands of the slum dwellers for fixing the sanitation issues in the slums, you might not have as much corruption. Insurance is not going to cover this problem. Most of the natural disasters are uninsured or underinsured. And Indonesia is in the path of major climate change. So we need budgets for, and budgeting for quality of life elements as a new toolkit. And that's what I've done to try to bring Homeland Security to everyone. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? We have time for a couple of questions. Yes, in the center.
This is fascinating. Thank you. Just two quick comments. What you're talking about reminds me very much of Plato's Republic, these brilliant people coming up with a bureaucracy. It's brilliant, and it's just an interesting 2,000-year forward recreation. But also, I thought there was a whole field of economic study called developmental economics, and I'm wondering if you've spoken to people that are known in that industry, in that field, because this is exactly what I think the developmental economics profession has been trying to deal with or grapple with over the past 30 or 40 years.
I have. I've talked to them at TED, and I've been waiting for the, let's call it soft empirical proof. The discussion of Fiji and Indonesia was, I mean, there's not quantitative proof, but it's the analogy that I needed to say that there's accountancy that's written into the budgeting process of those two countries and many other countries at the village finance level. I needed to find that, and I needed to see it used. And in Indonesia, it's only about 3 years old. So yes, I have talked to Paul and others about this. And you know, if I can put a plug in, I do think the New School for Sustainability needs to have some people who know finance, because it could help, it couldn't hurt to have people who know finance as part of a new school for sustainability in terms of what are the financial structures from the very basic level of a digital wallet up, obviously, to derivatives that can make this transition happen much faster and be part of the systemic process by which we move money across the financial systems. And for your first comment, my Latin teacher would really love that I have honored Plato.
Another question? Tara.
Hello, I have a question. Actually, I'd like you to help me validate just a theory that I have. I work for Microsoft, and in general, you know, in a for-profit industry, we tend to have KPIs or, you know, other metrics, or, you know, take the three-letter acronym that you like, that we go towards. And one of the things that has always bothered me about sustained development is it's actually a bunch of metrics to avoid. It's not a metric to go towards. And I guess, how much do you think that plays a role in achieving some of these goals? Now, one theory I've had is a reasonable metric to go for, whether it's for health or for education or sanitary goals, is really a predictive score, perhaps, of getting to the place that we all believe is bad. That might be then something to aim for, to get towards. What are your thoughts?
So that's what sustainable resiliency as a score is. It's a predicted, what is the likelihood out of 800 that you will reach a 10% improvement in every one of the QOL over the next 10 years based on what you didn't do, frankly. as a region in the last 10 years. So you spend all this money for 10 years against those KPIs. What's the likelihood that with your own efforts it's going to get there? And so that does create not only a pricing mechanism for what is the alternative investment that the governments would have to make, it also brings in those adjacencies that reduce costs, in effect, to achieve those KPIs. And the sustainable resiliency, as a bond lawyer, I can take the Moody's, Fitch, and S&P and get you a different bond rating, a cheaper bond rating for your city, because you can prove that 10 years from now it'll be cheaper to run your city with these improvements than before.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a pleasure, as always.